Welcome back, everybody, to Lesson 9-3, The Equal Rights Struggle Expands. Through our last two lessons, we've looked largely at the civil rights movement through the lens of African Americans. Today, we're going to broaden that lens a little bit to look at some of the other groups that were also successful in pushing for equal rights during this time. We're going to begin with Cesar Chavez. Inspired by Martin Luther King to push for greater rights for Hispanic Americans, Cesar Chavez led the Latin American Hispanic push for equal rights. Migrant laborers had witnessed some extremely harsh conditions and low pay in America during the 1950s and 60s. These were difficult conditions to endure, and under the leadership of Chavez, they decided to no longer endure those. So Chavez begins to organize a labor effort in order to expand these civil rights. In the 1960s, most Mexican Americans, one group of Hispanics, lived in Southern California. And this group organized into La Raza Unida, the United People. And the goals of this group included better jobs, better pay, better access to education, and better housing. And they saw a lot of success by uniting the voting powers of Mexican Americans in Southern California. They were able to elect a large number of Mexican Americans to political office, who would then in turn focus on Mexican American issues. We also saw student movements. Mexican American students in Los Angeles joined protest movements against the particularly poor quality of predominantly Hispanic schools in that city. And in 1968, students organized a walkout of their schools to protest and draw attention to this horrible condition of those schools. And eventually the city admitted that those schools really did need to be fixed and reformed, that there were structural problems, building problems, and teaching problems that had persisted for far too long in those predominantly Hispanic schools. So those were addressed. Now, part of the challenges, however, in Hispanic civil rights movement is the diversity of Hispanics. A lot of Hispanics come together from very different backgrounds. Now, all Hispanics had come from countries that were once colonized by Spain or Spain, but had long since formed their own separate independent cultures. And the interests of a Puerto Rican, who's a U.S. citizen, would not necessarily be the same as a Colombian. Some immigrants came from countries that were more liberal. Some were more conservative. Some held strongly to religion. Others did not. And so the interests of Hispanics as a group were very diverse because Hispanics themselves were very diverse. And so this was a barrier to the success of this group, this movement. On the topic of Native Americans have different tribes and divided interests, much like Hispanics, except for far more so. And the U.S. had long taken advantage of this division, the idea that there was no united Native American group. The old military strategy is to divide and then conquer. Well, with Native Americans, you didn't need to divide. These groups were already divided in terms of land and culture. But in 1948, Native Americans started to realize, or took important steps upon the realization of this division being a huge barrier. And they united to form a group called the National Congress of American Indians, the NCAI, to fight against the government. In 1968, Native Americans shifted in order to achieve greater independence. This is the idea that Native Americans will never be equal within an American society. So it's important then for them to have societies of their own. More independence is how they'll achieve their civil rights. And the American Indian movement, AIM, A-I-M, argued not for civil rights, but sovereign rights, independence. In 1975, they saw a degree of success with the Indian Self-Determination Act, which gave tribal governments control over writing and enforcing their own laws. And now Native American reservations within the United States can operate themselves to a large degree like their own state within the United States and can pass and enforce their own laws. An additional group during our civil and equal rights movement was women. In the early 1960s, women still faced tremendous discrimination throughout the U.S. Women were kept out of certain jobs. That was men's work. And in many cases, were paid less for the same work. This problem actually continues today as well. Married women, in many cases, needed their husbands to sign legal paperwork for the family. It wasn't valid if it just had a woman's signature. She needed her husband's signature for it to be a legal document. And additionally, women who were expected children could be fired from their jobs because their employer didn't want to deal with the hassles of having a pregnant employee. Now, the National Organization for Women, NOW, was organized to fight against this. It was organized around the ideas of Betty Friedan, who was an early advocate for the change that led to the NOW movement. Her book, The Feminine Mystique, gained her a following, and she turned that following into the movement, the National Organization for Women, and now has continued to work for equal rights for women. One of their big targets being the Equal Rights Amendment, an amendment to the United States Constitution. This amendment would push to make sure that gender discrimination was illegal throughout the United States. Now, in 1972, this amendment was passed by Congress, but there are two steps in making a constitutional amendment official. It has to be passed by Congress, and it has to be passed by 3/4 of the states in the United States. We need 38 state governments to approve of the law. Only 35 of our 50 states approved of this law. This is our map showing ratification. All the states in the darker green did ratify it and pass the Equal Rights Amendment, saying that this should be a national law, but the lighter colors did not. Now, I should note the ones circled in green, these states have passed their own state laws. Equal rights is a state law issue as well. And in Illinois, for example, you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender in Illinois, not because there's a federal law, but because there's a state law. But Illinois did not vote to support the federal law outlawing gender-based discrimination. And so the Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution never did pass. This was a failed effort in the equal rights struggle. It remains a challenge today. There are some groups that are still pushing for the Equal Rights Amendment, but in most states in the United States, it is state law that you cannot discriminate based upon gender. And therefore, some argue that a federal law is not needed. All right, that is all for today. I hope that you learned something and enjoyed this lesson, and I will see you next time. Farewell.